February 19th, 1945. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood in his underground command post 8 stories beneath Mount Suribachi, listening to the distant thunder of American naval guns. The bombardment had continued for 3 days, without pause. 72 hours of shells ranging from 5-inch destroyer rounds to the massive 16-inch projectiles from battleships, each one weighing as much as a small automobile. The mountain shook with each impact. Dust filtered down from the concrete ceiling. Communications officers shouted into field phones, trying to maintain contact with positions across the island as the barrage systematically destroyed everything above ground. Kuribayashi had expected this. He had prepared for it. What he had not prepared for, what no amount of intelligence gathering or tactical planning could have anticipated, was what he would witness in the next 12 hours. The Japanese general was no stranger to American military capability. He had served as a military attaché in Washington, D.C. from 1928 to 1930, had traveled extensively across the United States, had visited factories and military installations, had studied American industrial capacity with the careful attention of a professional officer gathering intelligence on a potential future enemy. He had returned to Japan with detailed reports warning that war with America would be catastrophic. The Japanese military planners fundamentally misunderstood the industrial scale of their potential adversary. His warnings had been ignored. Now, 6 years into the Pacific War, he commanded the defense of Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 square miles in size, positioned directly along the bombing route from the Mariana Islands to mainland Japan. The island's strategic value was undeniable. American bombers flying from Saipan and Tinian to Tokyo flew 1,100 miles each way without fighter escort because no existing American fighter had sufficient range. Iwo Jima, positioned halfway along that route, could serve as an emergency landing field for damaged bombers and a base for fighter escorts that would extend American air superiority directly over Japanese cities. Kuribayashi understood that America would come for this island with everything available. He had spent 7 months preparing defenses that he believed could make the American victories so costly they might reconsider their island-hopping strategy. His garrison numbered 21,000 troops, including some of Japan's best remaining combat units. He had supervised construction of 11 miles of underground tunnels, 1,500 defensive positions, all connected by passages that allowed troops to move unseen beneath the surface. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The defensive philosophy Kuribayashi had implemented broke with traditional Japanese doctrine. There would be no banzai charges, no wasteful human wave attacks against American firepower. Instead, his troops would fight from prepared positions, fall back through tunnels when threatened, reappear in different locations, and inflict maximum casualties through sustained resistance rather than glorious death. Every cave had multiple entrances. Every bunker had reinforced concrete overhead protection. Every position had interlocking fields of fire with neighboring strongpoints. The Americans would have to dig them out position by position, paying in blood for every yard of volcanic ash. The island itself seemed designed by nature to aid defenders. Mount Suribachi, an extinct volcano 550 feet tall, dominated the southern tip, providing observation over the entire landing area. The beaches consisted of loose volcanic ash that would bog down vehicles and offer no cover for advancing infantry. Terraced plateaus rising toward the island's northern highlands created natural defensive lines. Kuribayashi had spent months transforming these natural advantages into an integrated fortress. His intelligence officers had provided estimates of American strength. They anticipated the assault force would number perhaps 40,000 troops, supported by several aircraft carriers and a dozen battleships. The Americans had used similar forces at Saipan and Guam. Kuribayashi expected a difficult battle lasting perhaps 2 weeks before his garrison was overwhelmed. He had accepted that Iwo Jima could not be held indefinitely. but he intended to make the Americans pay a price so terrible they would remember this island for generations. February 16th had brought the first indication that American preparations exceeded Japanese estimates. The pre-invasion bombardment that morning had been delivered by 6 battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, and 16 destroyers. Kuribayashi's artillery officers, observing from concealed positions, counted the vessels offshore and revised their calculations. This was more naval firepower than Japan had possessed in its entire combined fleet at the war's start, and this was just the bombardment group for a single island assault. The shelling had continued for 72 hours with methodical precision. American spotting aircraft circled overhead, directing fire onto specific targets. When Japanese gun positions revealed themselves by firing back, they were immediately buried under concentrated naval gunfire. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to hold fire, to remain concealed, to preserve their strength for the actual invasion. Let the Americans waste their shells on empty positions and abandoned installations. The real defenses, buried deep underground, would survive. On the morning of February 19th, the naval guns shifted to a rolling barrage pattern, walking their fire inland from the beaches. Kuribayashi recognized this as preparation for the landing. He ordered his commanders to battle stations and climbed to an observation post cut into the rock beneath Suribachi's summit. Through a narrow firing slit, he could see the ocean to the southeast. What he saw made him pause and call for his chief of staff. The horizon was solid with ships, not dozens, not scores, hundreds of vessels extending as far as visibility allowed, battleships with their distinctive superstructures, carriers that looked like floating airfields, cruisers and destroyers by the dozens, and behind them, packed so densely their hulls seemed to touch, were transport vessels and landing craft in numbers that defied belief. Kuribayashi had his binoculars on the fleet, counting vessels by type, calculating troop capacity, trying to comprehend the scale of what approached his defenses. His chief of staff, Colonel Nishi, arrived and took position at an adjacent observation slit. He too fell silent, staring at the armada offshore. "How many troops?" Nishi finally asked. Kuribayashi continued scanning the fleet before responding. "If those transport vessels are loaded to capacity, and if the landing craft are deploying from ships beyond our visual range, then they are bringing at least 70,000 troops. Perhaps more." Nishi looked at his commander. 70,000. For 8 square miles. "They are not thinking in terms of adequate force," Kuribayashi said quietly. "They are thinking in terms of overwhelming force. They will land more troops in the first day than we have defending the entire island." This assessment would prove conservative. The American operational plan, finalized months earlier by Admiral Richmond Turner and Marine General Holland Smith, called for assault by 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Each division numbered approximately 20,000 troops at full strength. The landing plans specified that 2 divisions, 4th and 5th, would assault simultaneously on the first day, while 3rd Division remained in floating reserve. If the mathematics worked perfectly, if every landing craft delivered its assigned troops without loss, if the beaches could handle the traffic, then approximately 40,000 Marines would land on D-Day. The planners had built in redundancy, extra landing craft, extra supplies, extra fire support. They had learned from previous operations that Pacific Island assaults consumed material at rates that exceeded pre-war planning assumptions, so they brought more, always more. At 0600 hours, the landing craft began their approach. Kuribayashi watched through his binoculars as the first waves formed up 4,000 yards offshore, organized in lines that extended along the entire southern coast of the island. The craft moved in synchronized waves, maintaining precise intervals, approaching the beach in a choreographed assault that demonstrated sophisticated command and control. Each wave consisted of 68 landing craft, each craft carrying approximately 30 Marines. That meant each wave delivered roughly 2,000 troops. Kuribayashi counted the waves, 8 waves visible, approaching in staggered intervals. Behind them, more waves were forming up at the line of departure. He did rapid calculations. If they maintained this rate, if the waves continued without interruption, they could land 16,000 troops in the first 4 hours. His artillery commander, positioned at an adjacent observation post, requested permission to fire. The landing craft were well within range of coastal guns that had been carefully registered on the approaches. A single concentrated barrage could destroy dozens of craft, kill hundreds of Americans before they ever reached the beach. Kuribayashi denied permission. "Let them land," he ordered. "Let them commit their forces to the beaches, where they have no cover and no room to maneuver. When they are concentrated in the killing zones, then we open fire." This was the tactical calculation that had guided his defensive planning. Traditional doctrine called for defending at the water's edge, destroying the enemy during their most vulnerable moment, as they transitioned from sea to land. But Kuribayashi had studied American capabilities. Their naval gunfire could saturate any position that revealed itself. Their close air support could strike within minutes of being called. Any Japanese gun that fired at the landing craft would be identified and destroyed before the Marines even reached the beach. Better to let them land, let them advance inland, let them move beyond the protective umbrella of naval guns. Then, from concealed positions, from interlocking fields of fire, from tunnels that allowed movement between strongpoints, his garrison would inflict casualties that would shock the Americans and demonstrate that this island would not fall easily. The first landing craft touched the beach at 0902 hours. Marines poured out, struggling through the volcanic ash that rose above their ankles. The beach consisted of loose black sand that provided no traction, no stability. Men fell, vehicles bogged down, equipment sank into the ash, but they kept coming. Wave after wave, landing craft driving directly onto the beach, dropping their ramps, disgorging troops and equipment, retracting, and heading back to the transport vessels for more. Kuribayashi watched the build-up with growing concern. The Americans were landing faster than his most pessimistic estimates. The volcanic ash that he had counted on to slow their advance was indeed hindering individual movement, but the sheer number of troops compensated. They simply brought so many Marines that even with reduced mobility, their aggregate combat power grew by the minute. By 0930 hours, 3,000 Marines were ashore. By 1000 hours, 6,000. The beach had become a scene of organized chaos. Amtraks, amphibious tractors that could crawl through the volcanic ash, were bringing supplies forward. Engineers were attempting to create vehicle paths through the softest areas. Medical personnel were establishing aid stations. Command posts were being organized. And still the landing craft kept coming, wave after wave, their coxswains driving directly onto the beach with mechanical precision. At 10:15 hours, Kuribayashi gave the order to commence fire. Across the island, Japanese artillery opened up simultaneously. Mortars, ranging from light 50mm battalion weapons to massive 320mm spigot mortars, began dropping shells into the landing zones. Coastal defense guns, carefully concealed in reinforced bunkers, fired directly into the massed troops on the beaches. Machine gun positions, positioned to create interlocking fire across predetermined killing zones, opened up with devastating effect. The carefully prepared defensive plan executed exactly as designed. Marines on the beaches found themselves under fire from positions they could not see. The loose volcanic ash that hindered their movement also made it impossible to dig proper foxholes. Men tried to burrow into the ash, but it collapsed back on itself, offering minimal protection. Casualties mounted rapidly. Within the first 30 minutes of sustained Japanese fire, more than 500 Marines were killed or wounded. The beach medical stations were overwhelmed. Corpsmen worked frantically, treating sucking chest wounds, applying tourniquets, calling for evacuation of the most serious cases. But even as the casualties mounted, even as Japanese fire turned sections of the beach into killing zones, the landing craft kept coming. New waves, arriving on schedule, moved through the fire, grounded on the beach, and delivered fresh troops. The Americans were not retreating, they were not pausing, they were not even slowing down. They were absorbing casualties that would have broken traditional military units and continuing their landing operation with mechanical efficiency. Kuribayashi observed this with professional detachment, even as it challenged his operational assumptions. He had calculated that heavy casualties would force the Americans to pause, to reconsider, to adjust their approach. Instead, They seem to have anticipated casualties and built redundancy into their plan. For every Marine killed or wounded on the beach, 2 more landed to replace him. The mathematical superiority was overwhelming. By 1100 hours, despite nearly an hour of sustained Japanese fire, more than 10,000 Marines were ashore. They had established a beachhead 400 yards deep in some areas. Though still confined to the southern portion of the island, American naval gunfire had identified and engaged many of the Japanese positions that had revealed themselves. Counter-battery fire was systematic and devastating. Gun positions that had taken months to construct were being destroyed within minutes of firing their first shells. But Kuribayashi's defensive design proved its value. When one position was destroyed, troops moved through underground tunnels to alternate firing points. When American aircraft struck a bunker, defenders fell back to secondary positions and continued engaging. The defense was eroding, being ground down by superior firepower, but it was exacting a toll far higher than previous Pacific Island assaults. The Americans had expected high casualties. They had prepared for them. But the intensity of fire, the difficulty of the terrain, and the sophistication of Japanese defenses were testing their resolve in ways that raw numbers could not fully capture. At noon, Kuribayashi received a report that shocked him more than the initial landing fleet. His forward observers reported that the Americans were bringing tanks ashore, not light tanks or armored cars, but M4 Sherman medium tanks weighing 30 tons each, along with specialized armored bulldozers and tracked vehicles carrying flamethrowers. The volcanic ash that had stopped earlier vehicles was being conquered through engineering. American Seabees, naval construction battalions, were laying steel matting and perforated planking across the worst sections, creating temporary roads that allowed heavy vehicles to move inland. The speed of this engineering work defied Kuribayashi's understanding of military logistics. In the Japanese army, creating vehicle paths across difficult terrain required days of manual labor by infantry troops. The Americans were doing it in hours, using specialized equipment and prefabricated materials that they had brought specifically for this purpose. They had anticipated the terrain challenge and arrived with solutions already designed and tested. By 1300 hours, 12,000 Marines were ashore. The beachhead had expanded to 800 yards deep along a 2-mile front. Japanese resistance remained fierce. Every cave, every bunker, every fortified position was being defended exactly as Kuribayashi had ordered. His troops were fighting with discipline and courage, inflicting heavy casualties on the advancing Marines. But they were being overwhelmed by simple mathematics. The Americans were landing troops faster than Japanese fire could kill them. For every position that held up the American advance, 2 more were being bypassed or destroyed. Colonel Nishi, monitoring reports from forward commanders, approached Kuribayashi with a casualty estimate. "We're losing approximately 150 men per hour across all defensive sectors. At this rate, we'll be reduced to half strength within 4 days. Kuribayashi nodded slowly. He had expected heavy casualties, but not this quickly. The American firepower, the coordination between naval guns, aircraft, and ground forces was more sophisticated than intelligence had indicated. "And the Americans?" he asked. "How many casualties are they suffering?" Nishi consulted his notes. "Forward observers estimate between 800 and 1,000 American casualties in the first 4 hours, perhaps 200 killed, the rest wounded." Kuribayashi did the calculation. The Americans had suffered more casualties in 4 hours than his entire garrison would suffer in a day. But they had also landed 12,000 troops. They were trading casualties at a ratio that they could sustain almost indefinitely, while his garrison, cut off from reinforcement or resupply, could only diminish. This was the fundamental asymmetry that had defined the Pacific War from the beginning. Japan fought with the forces available, carefully husbanding resources, calculating acceptable losses. America fought with overwhelming material superiority, accepting casualties that would be catastrophic for any other nation because they could replace those losses and continue operations without pause. At 1400 hours, Word came that American forces had cut across the island at its narrowest point, severing Mount Suribachi from the main defensive positions to the north. This had happened in 5 hours. Kuribayashi had expected the island to be divided, but not until at least the second day. The speed of American operations was compressing his defensive timeline. By 1500 hours, 16,000 Marines were ashore. The initial assault divisions, 4th and 5th, were fully landed. Elements of the 3rd Division were beginning to come ashore as reinforcements. The Americans had exceeded their own ambitious schedule. They had landed 16,000 troops in 6 hours on a beach that was under sustained fire from deeply entrenched defenders who had months to prepare. Kuribayashi stood in his command post, reviewing the tactical maps that his staff continuously updated based on field reports. Red marks indicated lost positions, blue marks showed areas still under Japanese control. The pattern was unmistakable. His carefully prepared defense was being compressed, pushed back, ground down by an assault force that seemed to have unlimited resources and absolute willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of their objective. That evening, as the first day's fighting tapered off with darkness, Kuribayashi sent a message to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. His report was factual, professional, devoid of emotion. He detailed the American landing force, the casualties inflicted, the current tactical situation. He ended with an assessment that he knew would shock his superiors. The Americans have landed 16,000 troops in the first day. They have established a beachhead that cannot be eliminated by available forces. They possess material superiority that exceeds previous intelligence estimates by a factor of 3. Iwo Jima will fall. The only question is how long we can make them pay for each yard of this island. This was not the message that Tokyo wanted to hear. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit over material, willpower over industrial capacity. Kuribayashi knew his assessment would be viewed as defeatism by many staff officers who had never witnessed American operations firsthand. But he had seen the fleet offshore. He had counted the landing craft. He had watched 16,000 Marines land under fire, establish a beachhead, and prepare for continued operations, all within 12 hours. He understood what this meant. The Americans were not fighting a battle. They were implementing an industrial process. They had calculated the force required to take this island, then brought twice that force, just to ensure success. They had anticipated losses and built redundancy into every aspect of their operation. They had brought enough men, enough equipment, enough supplies to sustain operations regardless of Japanese resistance. This was not military brilliance. It was industrial capacity applied with mechanical efficiency. And against that capacity, courage and determination, while necessary, were not sufficient. Kuribayashi did not share these thoughts with his staff. He simply issued orders for the next day's defense, organized his remaining forces, and prepared to make the Americans pay the highest possible price for their victory. But privately, watching the ships offshore through his observation slit, counting the vessels that continued to arrive even as darkness fell, he understood that this battle had been decided not on this volcanic island, but in the factories and shipyards and training camps of America. They had built a military machine that could absorb casualties, that would destroy other armies, that could land 16,000 troops in a single day on a defended beach, that could sustain operations with a logistics train that never seemed to diminish. Japan had been fighting this war with the resources available in 1941. America had been building new resources every single day since then, and now, in February of 1945, the accumulated weight of that industrial production was coming ashore on Iwo Jima at a rate of 3,000 troops per hour. The second day brought realization of additional American capabilities that Kuribayashi's intelligence had failed to predict. At dawn, the Marines resumed their attack with close air support that made Japanese daytime movement virtually impossible. Aircraft from the escort carriers offshore flew continuous missions, striking any position that revealed itself. The Americans had achieved such air superiority that Japanese aircraft could not even approach the island. The entire battle was being fought under a sky completely controlled by the enemy. But it was the logistics that truly revealed the depth of American preparation. By mid-morning of the second day, supply vessels were unloading directly onto the beaches. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, fuel, all arriving in quantities that seemed impossible for an island where 16,000 troops had landed just 30 hours earlier. Kuribayashi's logistics officers, who had spent months carefully calculating supply requirements for the 21,000-man garrison, watched in disbelief as the Americans built supply dumps larger than anything the Japanese had accumulated during 7 months of preparation. A captured Japanese soldier, interrogated on the third day, described what he had witnessed during the landing. The Americans, he said, were not behaving like an army fighting for survival. They were behaving like an army that had already won and was simply implementing the occupation. They moved with confidence that came from absolute material superiority. When they encountered a defended position, they did not sacrifice troops in futile assaults. They simply called for fire support, naval guns or aircraft or tanks, and reduced the position to rubble before advancing. They treated warfare as an engineering problem, applying overwhelming force to each obstacle until it ceased to exist. This was the American way of war in the Pacific by 1945, not clever tactics, not brilliant maneuvers, not inspirational leadership, though all those elements existed. Instead, it was the application of industrial capacity on such a scale that traditional military virtues became secondary to simple mathematical superiority. They brought more, they built more, they landed more, they sustained more, and they accepted casualties that would have ended other nations' willingness to fight because they could replace those losses and continue operations without pause. Kuribayashi had warned his superiors in Tokyo before the war that conflict with America would be decided not by courage or skill, but by factory output and resource availability. Now, watching 16,000 American Marines come ashore in a single day on one small volcanic island, he saw his prediction validated with brutal clarity. The Americans had not outfought the Japanese garrison. They had simply brought so much force that fighting became pointless. They had turned warfare into industrial production, and in that contest, Japan had no chance of victory. The battle for Iwo Jima would continue for 36 more days. Kuribayashi's garrison would fight with extraordinary courage and discipline, making the Americans pay for every yard of volcanic ash. By the time organized resistance ended in late March, nearly 7,000 Marines would be dead and 19,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison would be virtually annihilated, with only about 1,000 of the original 21,000 troops captured alive. But the outcome was never in doubt after that first day. The Americans had demonstrated a capability that transcended tactical skill or strategic brilliance. They had shown that they could land 16,000 troops in one day on a defended beach and sustain that force indefinitely against any level of resistance. This was not warfare as it had been understood for centuries. This was industrial capacity weaponized, and Japan had no answer for it. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders extended beyond simple recognition of material inferiority. Many of Kuribayashi's troops were veterans who had fought across the Pacific. They had faced American forces at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. They understood American combat capabilities and had developed tactical responses based on that understanding. What they witnessed at Iwo Jima was different, not in kind, but in scale. The Americans had always possessed material advantages, but now those advantages had reached levels that made traditional combat calculations meaningless. A Japanese artillery officer, Captain Tsunezo Wachi, kept a diary during the battle that was recovered after his death. His entry for February 20th, the second day of the invasion, captured this realization with stark clarity. We destroyed 17 landing craft today with direct hits from our coastal guns. Each craft carried approximately 30 men, perhaps 500 Americans killed. By evening, I counted 43 replacement craft landing troops at the same beaches we had fired upon. They replaced 500 casualties, with 1,500 fresh troops in the same day. We cannot kill them faster than they can land. This is not a battle, it is mathematics. This understanding permeated through the Japanese garrison during the first week of fighting. The Americans were not succeeding through superior tactics or better training. They were succeeding through sheer abundance. When a Sherman tank was destroyed, 2 more appeared. When a battalion suffered heavy casualties and pulled back, a fresh battalion moved forward. When ammunition ran low, supply craft arrived with more. The American logistics chain seemed infinite, a constant flow of material that never diminished, regardless of Japanese resistance. The American Marines, for their part, were experiencing their own shock, though of a different nature. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions that landed on D-Day were composed largely of combat veterans. Many had fought at Saipan and Tinian the previous summer. They understood Pacific Island warfare, expected fierce Japanese resistance, and had trained specifically for this assault. But even these veterans found Iwo Jima different from previous operations. The volcanic ash created mobility problems that no amount of training had prepared them for. Corporal Edward Hartman of the 28th Marines described the experience in a letter written 3 weeks after the landing. You take 2 steps forward and slide 1 step back. The ash is like walking through loose sand, except it's worse because there's no solid ground underneath. We carried full combat loads, 65 pounds of equipment and ammunition. In that ash, it felt like twice that. Men were exhausting themselves, just trying to advance 50 yards. The Japanese defensive tactics compounded the physical difficulties. Kuribayashi's orders prohibiting wasteful banzai charges meant that Marines faced an enemy who fought from prepared positions, fell back when threatened, and reappeared elsewhere. There were no glorious charges to mow down with machine gun fire. Instead, there was the slow, methodical work of clearing caves and bunkers, knowing that even destroyed positions might be reoccupied through underground tunnels. Private First Class Donald Graves, a flamethrower operator with the 5th Marine Division, described the psychological toll. You'd clear a bunker, watch it collapse under satchel charges, move forward 50 yards, and then take fire from the same position you just destroyed. They had tunnels everywhere. You couldn't kill them permanently. You could only make them move to a different firing position. It was like fighting ghosts who kept coming back. Yet, despite these challenges, despite casualties that exceeded even the pessimistic pre-invasion estimates, the American advance continued. The material superiority that Kuribayashi had identified from his command post manifested at every tactical level. When a Marine squad encountered a fortified bunker, they did not have to sacrifice men in frontal assaults. They could call for tanks, which arrived within minutes. They could request naval gunfire, which arrived within the hour. They could wait for air support, which flew continuous missions throughout daylight hours. The Americans had options that their opponents lacked, and those options came from the vast logistics network that had landed 16,000 troops on D-Day and continued landing thousands more each subsequent day. By February 25th, the 6th day of battle, more than 40,000 Marines were on Iwo Jima. The tiny island, 8 square miles of volcanic rock, now held more American troops than had landed on D-Day at Normandy. The concentration of combat power was unprecedented. Every Marine on the island was within range of Japanese defensive positions. There was no rear area, no safe zone. Even supply troops and medical personnel came under fire regularly. But the Americans compensated through sheer numbers and continuous reinforcement. The 3rd Marine Division, held in reserve during the initial landing, was fully committed by the end of the first week. Artillery batteries, brought ashore in sections and assembled on the beaches, provided fire support that supplemented naval guns. Engineering battalions worked continuously to improve beach access, creating vehicle routes that allowed steady flow of supplies forward. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi occurred on February 23rd, 4 days after the landing. Marines of the 28th Regiment, fighting their way up the slopes of the extinct volcano, reached the summit and planted an American flag that was visible across the entire island and to the ships offshore. The moment became one of the war's most famous photographs, captured by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. But the flag raising, while symbolically important, represented only a small portion of the battle. Suribachi was the southernmost point of the island. The bulk of Japanese defensive positions lay to the north, in terrain even more favorable to the defenders. The Central Plateau and Northern Highlands contained the majority of Kuribayashi's garrison and his most sophisticated defenses. The fighting that followed the flag raising would be more costly than everything that preceded it. The American casualties during the first week totaled more than 8,000 men, with nearly 2,000 killed. These numbers would have ended most military operations. At Tarawa, where American casualties over 4 days exceeded 3,000, public reaction in the United States had been shock and anger. Iwo Jima was producing casualties at twice that rate, yet the operation continued without pause. The strategic importance of the island, its location along the bombing route to Japan, its potential as a fighter base, all justified the cost in the calculation of American military planners. More fundamentally, the American military, by 1945, possessed the capacity to sustain operations despite casualties that would have been prohibitive earlier in the war. The replacement system brought fresh troops forward continuously. The medical evacuation chain moved wounded personnel to hospital ships within hours. The logistics network supplied ammunition and equipment without interruption. The industrial base back in America continued producing everything needed to sustain combat operations indefinitely. Kuribayashi, monitoring the battle from his command post, recognized that time was now his only weapon. He could not win. He could not stop the American advance, but he could slow it, make it costly, force the Americans to pay in blood for every cave and bunker. His orders to his commanders emphasized this singular objective. We are not trying to win. We are trying to inflict maximum casualties before the inevitable end. Every day, we hold this island. Every American soldier we kill or wound contributes to Japan's strategic position by making the enemy question whether the cost of invading the home islands is acceptable. This strategic calculation was sound in theory. In practice, it underestimated American resolve and overestimated Japanese capacity to influence American decision-making through casualties alone. The American public, while shocked by the mounting losses at Iwo Jima, did not waver in support for the war. The American military, while concerned about the casualty rates, it did not reduce the intensity of operations, and American industrial capacity continued delivering material in quantities that made the battle's outcome never in doubt. The fighting progressed through March with brutal consistency. Marines advanced yard by yard through terrain that offered every advantage to defenders. Japanese troops fought from positions that had to be destroyed individually, often with flamethrowers or demolition charges. The casualties mounted on both sides, but the mathematical reality remained constant. The Americans could replace their losses. The Japanese could not. By early March, with 2/3 of the island under American control, Kuribayashi's garrison had been reduced to approximately 11,000 effectives. They held the Northern Highlands, a maze of caves and fortified positions that would require weeks to clear. But the outcome was no longer in question. American forces controlled the airfields, the primary objective of the invasion. Engineers were already repairing the runways, even as fighting continued in the north. On March 4th, just 13 days after the initial landing, the first American bomber made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima. A B-29 superfortress named Dynamite, damaged during a raid on Tokyo and unable to reach its base in the Marianas, landed on the still incomplete runway, while Marines fought Japanese defenders less than a mile away. The bomber's crew of 11 men survived because Iwo Jima existed as an emergency field. This single incident justified the invasion in the minds of many Americans. The island was already saving lives, even as the battle to control it continued. Over the following months, hundreds of damaged bombers would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima. bringing home thousands of aircrew who would otherwise have died, ditching in the Pacific Ocean. The strategic value that had motivated the invasion was being realized even before the fighting ended. But this validation of strategic planning offered no comfort to the Marines still engaged in combat, clearing the final Japanese positions through March. The last organized Japanese resistance ended on March 26th, 35 days after the initial landing. Kuribayashi sent a final message to Tokyo on March 23rd. The battle is ending. All officers and men of the garrison have fought with exemplary courage. We have inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy and delayed their advance as long as possible with available forces. We are now reduced to approximately 300 effectives without supplies or ammunition. I apologize to His Majesty for failing to defend this island adequately. We will fight to the last man. He was killed in action on March 26th during a final defensive stand in the Northern Highlands. His body was never recovered, likely consumed in the flames of a cave system collapse. The final American casualty count for Iwo Jima shocked even commanders who had anticipated heavy losses. 6,821 Marines and sailors killed, 19,217 wounded, total casualties of 26,000. 38. Nearly 40% of the landing force. Some units suffered casualty rates exceeding 75%. The 28th Marines, who had raised the flag on Suribachi, lost more than half their strength. The 27th Marines suffered similar losses. Every Marine division that fought on Iwo Jima required months to rebuild after the battle. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated. Of the 21,000 defenders, approximately 20,000 died in combat or committed suicide rather than surrender. Only 1,043 were captured, many of them wounded and unable to resist. The casualty exchange ratio, while favorable to the Japanese in purely numerical terms, meant nothing strategically. They had lost an entire garrison and gained nothing. The Americans had suffered terrible losses, but had taken the island and immediately put it to use. The debate over whether Iwo Jima was worth the cost began before the fighting even ended. Admiral William Leahy, Chief of Staff to President Roosevelt, later wrote in his memoir that he believed Iwo Jima was a mistake, that the casualties were not justified by the strategic gain. Other officers disagreed, pointing to the bombers saved, the fighter escort missions flown from Iwo's airfields, the psychological impact of capturing an island within Japan's inner defensive ring. This debate continues among military historians. What is undebatable is what the battle revealed about American military capability by the final year of the Pacific War. The ability to land 16,000 troops in one day on a heavily defended beach demonstrated operational sophistication and material abundance that had no parallel. The capacity to sustain combat operations for 36 days, despite catastrophic casualties, showed industrial depth and national resolve that Japan could not match. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima understood this at a visceral level. They had experienced both sides of the material equation. They had benefited from naval gunfire that could destroy any target they identified. They had called for air support that arrived within minutes. They had received supplies that never ran short, despite being on a tiny island 750 miles from the nearest American base. And simultaneously, they had faced an enemy who fought with courage and skill, but who possessed no answer to American material superiority. Corporal Tony Stein, who received the Medal of Honor posthumously for actions on D-Day at Iwo Jima, wrote a letter to his family during the battle that captured this duality. The Japs here fight harder than any we've faced before. They're not giving up. Every position has to be taken by force, but we've got everything we need to do the job. Every time we need ammo, it's there. Every time we need support, it comes. We're losing a lot of good men, but we're going to win because we've got more of everything than they do. More guns, more tanks, more planes, more supplies, more everything. That's the difference. The legacy of Iwo Jima extended far beyond the immediate strategic gains. The battle became symbolic of American determination and sacrifice in the Pacific War. The image of the flag raising on Suribachi became one of the most reproduced photographs in history, appearing on posters, stamps, and memorials. The Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, completed in 1954, depicts the flag raising and honors all Marines who have died in service since the Corps' founding. But for Japanese military planners, Iwo Jima offered a different lesson. The battle had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated defenses, even the most determined resistance, could not stop American forces once they committed to an objective. Kuribayashi had done everything possible to maximize American casualties. He had built defenses that utilized every advantage of terrain. He had forbidden wasteful tactics and implemented a defense in depth that extended the battle for 5 weeks. And yet, the Americans had taken the island on almost precisely the schedule their pre-invasion planning had projected. This realization influenced Japanese planning for the defense of Okinawa. The next and final major battle of the Pacific War. If even the perfect defense could not stop the Americans, then perhaps the only option was to make each battle so costly that the cumulative casualties would force negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. This calculation led to the kamikaze campaigns and the massive casualties at Okinawa, which in turn influenced American decision-making about invading the Japanese home islands and ultimately contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons. The shock that Japanese generals experienced when they realized America had landed 16,000 troops in one day at Iwo Jima was not simply surprise at a tactical achievement. It was recognition that they were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity had reached levels that made traditional military resistance futile. The Americans were not just winning battles, they were applying industrial processes to warfare itself, treating combat as a production problem to be solved through abundant material application. This was the fundamental transformation of warfare that occurred during World War II. Industrial capacity became more decisive than tactical skill. Logistics became more important than strategy. The ability to produce and deliver material to the battlefield in overwhelming quantities became the ultimate determinant of victory. The Americans had mastered this new form of warfare by 1945, and Iwo Jima was its demonstration. The 16,000 troops landed on D-Day represented just the visible tip of a massive logistics system. Behind those, Marines were the ships that brought them across the Pacific. Behind those ships were the shipyards that built them. Behind those shipyards were the factories producing steel. Behind those factories were the mines extracting ore. Behind all of it was an economy that had converted itself entirely to war production without collapsing, that had mobilized millions of workers, that had innovated continuously to increase efficiency and output. Japan had started the war with significant military advantages in training, experience, and tactical doctrine. But those advantages eroded steadily as American industry overwhelmed Japanese capacity. By 1945, Japanese factories were producing a handful of aircraft per month. American factories were producing thousands. Japanese shipyards could barely maintain existing vessels. American yards were launching new ships faster than they could be sunk. Japanese training programs struggled to replace combat losses. American training camps graduated new troops continuously. The landing at Iwo Jima was the culmination of this industrial mobilization. Every Marine who waded ashore, every bullet they fired, every bandage applied to their wounds represented the output of American factories and farms. The volcanic ash beach became the interface where American industrial production met Japanese martial tradition, and the outcome was never in doubt once the first landing craft touched shore. General Holland Smith, commanding the expeditionary force at Iwo Jima, wrote in his after-action report a passage that captured this reality with bureaucratic precision. The successful landing and subsequent operations on Iwo Jima were possible only through the availability of sufficient assault troops, adequate naval gunfire support, continuous air superiority, and a logistics system capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. These capabilities derived from American industrial production and strategic planning that anticipated requirements and delivered necessary material to the theater of operations. This dry military language described a revolution in warfare. The logistics system, capable of sustaining operations indefinitely, was code for an industrial economy that could produce war material faster than combat could consume it. The strategic planning that anticipated requirements meant a bureaucratic system that could calculate needs months in advance and coordinate production across thousands of factories. The successful landing of 16,000 troops in one day was not a tactical achievement. It was an industrial accomplishment. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, who struggled through volcanic ash under intense fire, who watched their friends die clearing bunkers and caves, experienced the battle at a deeply personal level. They displayed courage, determination, and sacrifice that earned 27 Medals of Honor, the highest concentration of that award in American military history. Their individual heroism was real and profound, but their collective success was predetermined by industrial forces beyond their control. This is perhaps the most significant lesson of Iwo Jima, and the reason why Japanese generals could not believe America had landed 16,000 troops in one day. The disbelief was not about the specific number. It was about what that number represented. It meant that America had achieved a level of military-industrial capability that made the war's outcome inevitable. Japan could win individual battles, could inflict terrible casualties, could demonstrate martial courage and tactical skill, but none of that mattered against an enemy who could land 16,000 troops on a defended beach in 12 hours and sustain them indefinitely with a logistics network that never failed. Kuribayashi had understood this from the beginning. His warnings to Tokyo in the 1930s about American industrial capacity had been ignored. His recognition on D-Day that the landing force exceeded anything anticipated simply confirmed what he had known for years. Japan had started a war it could not win against an enemy whose strength lay not in military tradition, but in factory output. The battle for Iwo Jima was decided not by the courage of its defenders or the skill of its attackers, but by production figures calculated in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Seattle. The volcanic island, 8 square miles of worthless rock that became one of the Pacific War's bloodiest battlefields, served as a physical manifestation of this industrial reality. Every square yard was fought over, often multiple times. Nearly 50,000 casualties, American and Japanese combined, occurred on terrain that had no intrinsic value. The value was strategic, the island's position along the bombing route to Japan, but the strategic value could only be realized through industrial capacity to project force across 750 miles of ocean and sustain combat operations for 5 weeks. Today, Iwo Jima remains under Japanese sovereignty, returned by the United States in 1968. The island is restricted to military personnel, with limited access for veterans and families of those who fought there. The landscape still bears scars from the battle. Rusted equipment protrudes from the volcanic ash. Cave systems remain unexplored. Unexploded ordnance makes large portions of the island dangerous. The battlefield has been preserved, not intentionally, but simply because the remoteness and continuing danger have prevented development. Veterans who return describe a surreal experience of walking across terrain where they fought more than 7 decades earlier. The beaches where 16,000 troops landed on D-Day are silent now, visited only occasionally by military personnel and historians. Mount Suribachi, where the famous flag-raising occurred, stands unchanged. The volcanic landscape, already ancient when the battle occurred, will outlast any human memory of the conflict. But the lessons of Iwo Jima persist beyond the physical battlefield. The battle demonstrated conclusively that modern industrial warfare favors nations with greater production capacity. Courage and skill matter, but they cannot overcome massive material inferiority. The ability to deliver force to a battlefield and sustain operations determines outcomes more than tactical brilliance or strategic sophistication. These lessons influenced military planning throughout the Cold War and continue shaping defense policy today. The shock experienced by Japanese generals watching 16,000 American troops land in one day was not unique to them or to that moment. Every military force that has faced American power since 1945 has confronted the same reality. The United States developed during World War II a capability to project force at scales that overwhelm opposition through sheer material abundance. This capability, first demonstrated comprehensively at Iwo Jima, became the foundation of American military doctrine for the following 8 decades. The Marines who came ashore on February 19th, 1945, did not think in these terms. They focused on immediate tactical problems: crossing the beach, finding cover, advancing inland, staying alive. The industrial forces that made their landing possible were invisible to them. They saw the ships offshore, the supplies on the beach, the air support overhead. But they did not see the factories in Detroit building tanks, the shipyards in California launching landing craft, the training camps across America preparing replacements, the farms in Iowa growing food, the mines in Pennsylvania extracting coal to fuel the industrial machine. All of that was behind them, supporting them, enabling them, and it was the accumulated weight of that industrial support that made the landing of 16,000 troops in one day not just possible, but routine. The Americans had developed systems and capabilities that could replicate this feat at any defended beach in the Pacific. Iwo Jima was not unique. It was simply the most costly application of a capability that had been refined through 3 years of island-hopping campaigns. For the Japanese defenders, this was the truly horrifying realization. If the Americans could do this at Iwo Jima, they could do it at Okinawa. They could do it at Kyushu. They could do it anywhere they chose to land. The defense in depth, the caves and tunnels, the martial spirit and willingness to die, none of it mattered against an enemy who could land overwhelming force anywhere and sustain it indefinitely. The war was already lost. The battles that followed were simply working through the inevitable mathematical conclusion. Kuribayashi's final message to Tokyo, apologizing for failing to defend the island adequately, reflected this tragic understanding. He had not failed through lack of courage or skill. He had failed because failure was inevitable against an enemy with such massive material superiority. His garrison had fought brilliantly, inflicted casualties far exceeding pre-invasion estimates, and held out longer than anyone expected. But they had still lost, and they had lost on approximately the timeline American planners had projected, because American industrial capacity had accurately calculated the force required and then delivered that force with mechanical efficiency. The story of Iwo Jima, of 16,000 troops landing in one day, is ultimately a story about industrial civilization applied to warfare. It demonstrates what happens when a modern industrial economy fully mobilizes for war. The results are overwhelming, impersonal, and ultimately unstoppable by any opponent who lacks equivalent industrial capacity. This is the reality that Japanese generals confronted in February 1945, and it is the reality that has shaped global military affairs ever since. The black volcanic beaches where Marines struggled through ash, where thousands died in combat that often occurred within yards of their enemies, where the personal violence of war was as brutal and immediate as any battlefield in history. Those beaches were simultaneously the site of an impersonal industrial process. The individual courage and suffering were real, but they occurred within a larger system that had calculated requirements, allocated resources, and delivered material in quantities sufficient to ensure victory, regardless of individual outcomes. This duality, the personal experience of combat occurring within the impersonal machinery of industrial war, defined the Pacific conflict and continues defining modern warfare. The Marines remember their individual fights, the specific caves and bunkers, the friends who died beside them. Historians remember the statistics, the casualty figures, the tonnages landed, the ships deployed. Both memories are accurate, both describe the same battle, and both reveal the same truth, that modern warfare is won not primarily through valor or sacrifice, though both are necessary, but through industrial capacity to sustain operations until the enemy's capacity is exhausted. When Japanese generals realized America had landed 16,000 troops in one day at Iwo Jima. They were not simply surprised by a number. They were confronting the end of a certain kind of warfare where courage and tradition could compete with industrial modernity. That era ended in the volcanic ash of a tiny Pacific island, buried under the material weight of American production. The battles continued for 6 more months, but the outcome had been determined by factories and shipyards and logistics systems that operated thousands of miles from the fighting, delivering force to the battlefield in quantities that made resistance futile. This is the legacy of Iwo Jima, not the iconic photograph, not the memorial, not even the individual acts of heroism. Though all those matter, the legacy is the demonstration that industrial capacity, properly mobilized and applied, determines outcomes in modern warfare. The 16,000 troops who landed on D-Day were just the visible manifestation of an industrial system that had calculated victory as an engineering problem and solved it through abundant material application. The shock experienced by Japanese generals was recognition that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire industrial civilization, and that against such force, traditional military virtues were necessary but not sufficient. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.